Hello, welcome to the lab. This is part one of my rebuild series for Yamaha TTR125 engine. This particular engine had 135 hours on the top end. Hours on the bottom end are unknown. It suddenly locked up during a 4-hour endurance race, so let's do some digging and see what the issue is. First things first, let's get the timing plugs off. I have these slick Yoshimura timing plugs, but the OEM ones are slotted. I like to use a wide bottle opener or a big washer to get the larger plug out, and a large flathead screwdriver or just a pair of pliers to get the smaller one out. Next, we're going to get a 17mm socket on a ratchet to spin the engine to top dead center. For reference, this engine rotates counterclockwise from this side of the bike. As you see here, I'm going back and forth to try and free up the engine. I'm now removing the upper timing cover with the 8mm socket. And once those two bolts are removed, the cover will just wiggle off. Then we'll remove the rocker covers, which vary between years, but this early model takes a 24mm socket. Next, I'm spinning the engine and setting it to top dead center, making sure it's on the compression stroke, which would make the timing mark on the cam sprocket line up. It may be hard to tell, but the engine is very notchy when I'm trying to spin it over. We're going to the cam chain tensioner, which takes a 10mm socket for the cap and then an 8mm for the body of the tensioner. As you can see here, I'm using a small flat blade screwdriver to take the tension off of the mechanism inside of the tensioner. Now I'm removing the intake boot before I damage it. It's held on with two 5mm Allen head bolts. Okay, now to remove the cam sprocket, we're going to take two 17mm sockets, one to hold the crankshaft and one to loosen the bolt that holds the cam sprocket on. And I'm casually busting my knuckles when it breaks loose. To make this easy, I'm going to use a magnet to grab the sprocket and work the chain off of it. To remove the cylinder head, we want to remove these 5mm Allens on the left side first. And then use a 12mm socket to loosen the head bolts in a crisscross pattern. We want to loosen them a quarter turn or so until all the tension is off of them. And we'll just zip these off with my M12 impact driver. And once the bolts are off, we can pull the head off and inspect it. The combustion chamber looks relatively normal. This engine was running on the rich side. Don't forget to remove and keep track of the dowel pins. Now we can get the head gasket and front guide out of the way and pull the cylinder off. The cylinder looks okay, but there's a brown hue in the crosshatch. It could just be oxidation from sitting all winter, but overall not bad. And now we have discovered the issue. It seems like the rod bearing has left the chat. I'm not surprised because I have no idea how many hours are on the crank. Moving on to the bottom end of the engine, we'll start with removing the wire for the neutral switch. If your bike does not have an electric start, you won't have this switch installed. Now we'll use an 8mm socket to zip off the stator cover bolts. It'll take a bit of force to overcome the magnet and get this cover off. Don't forget to keep track of the dowel pins. Here I'm removing the flywheel, so we can start with a 17mm socket on an impact wrench to remove the flywheel nut and washer. This puller setup looks elaborate because I didn't have the correct length bolts, but it's just a basic steering wheel puller with M8 bolts threaded into the open holes on the flywheel. You'll hear an audible pop when the flywheel comes free. So now we're removing the puller, and as you can see, my starter sprag has failed. You'll hear some terrible noises when using the electric start when these start to go. Now we want to remove the woodruff key from the crankshaft, so just work at it with a small flat blade screwdriver. And I always stick it to the magnet on the flywheel so it doesn't get lost. And now the one-way gear for the starter can come out. Don't lose that washer that fell off the back of it. With the gear out of the way, we can use a 10mm socket to remove the rear cam chain guide. This is a unique bolt with a sleeve, so we're going to keep it with the guide. Now we can remove the bracket for the starter idler gear. That's held on with two 8mm bolts, and then the bracket and the gear should come right off. It's a good idea to remove the shaft as well so it doesn't fall out. Now we can remove the timing chain. The neutral switch comes out. It typically takes a 14mm socket. If you haven't already, we can remove the countershaft sprocket. Then just line the plate up with the countershaft and pull them off. Now we can move over to the clutch side and start by removing the clutch cover with an 8mm socket. And while I'm pulling the bolts, if you like this video and want to follow along with the build, consider subscribing to the channel. I'll be doing some trick mods to this engine along the way that I don't see a lot of info about online. Okay, this gasket also came off clean. I can see some sludge build up in the corner there. Again, make sure you grab both dowel pins in the clutch cover. This screen is the first line of defense for oil contaminants. It's good practice to clean it regularly, which is why I like to have the gaskets come off cleanly. I usually pull the clutch cover and clean this screen every 14 hours or so. Now the pressure plate bolts come off with an 8mm socket, and you'll want to make sure you're loosening them evenly. After pulling the clutch springs, I just grab the last fiber plate and pull the clutch pack out with the pressure plate. You want to inspect the clutch basket for grooves like I have on this one. These aren't deep enough for me to take any real action. If they were super deep, you'd want to replace the clutch basket or file the grooves down. Next, I'm going to use a clutch holding tool to grab the clutch hub and tap a 19mm socket onto the nut. This will bend the tab out on the retaining washer. The clutch hub pulls off, followed by the toothed spacer, the clutch basket, the spacer, and lastly the conical washer. Now we can pull the kickstart assembly. You'll need a way to hold the piston and rod, so I use this old puller with a slot in it to go around the rod. Now with a 19mm socket on the impact, I'm going to remove the drive gear nut and washer. Keep an eye on the square woodruff key that I just dropped when removing the gear. Now the oil filter slides off, followed by the oil pump idler gear. Take note of the orientation. The groove side goes towards the crank bearing. Next is the kickstart idler gear, and that's held on with a snap ring. Take note of the washers on each side of the gear. There's another snap ring under the gear that holds the countershaft in place. Now we can pull out the shift rod that is accompanied by any oil that's left in the sump. Take a small flat blade screwdriver to remove the E-clip from the oil pump gear. Then the gear comes off with the washer on the backside. Now we can use an impact screwdriver with a JIS number 3 bit to knock the oil pump bolts loose and run them out with a regular number 3 screwdriver, and we can wiggle the oil pump out. Moving on to the shift star, we'll use a T30 Torx to remove the center bolt. After pulling the spring, the D10 arm comes off with a 10mm. This bolt is unique, so keep it with the D10 arm. And now I'm removing the 2 small dowels that locate the shift star. Now I can pull the clutch arm out, and if I use a magnet on the end of the primary shaft to grab the little ball bearing that lives inside of there. It's time to split the cases. All the bolts are 8mm. And there are 2 up by the cylinder on the right side of the engine. If you have a case splitter, that'd be ideal, but I just use a soft mallet and tap around the cases until the RTV lets go. Now I'll lay the engine over and finesse the case apart. I'll start by removing the rods and shift forks, and I always look for abnormal wear on the shift forks. This engine in particular had a habit of jumping out of 4th gear, so I'm looking for clues to correct that issue. Now the shift drum can be checked over. So far everything looks fine. Now I can grab both the primary and counter shafts and work them out of the case. The clutch rod and a couple of gears fall out at this point. Now I'm looking over and inspecting the square dog teeth on the transmission gears. Don't forget the washer that goes against the bearing. I see here that the dogs are worn on these gears, and it's no surprise because it's 3rd and 4th gear. Lastly, I'm going to take my soft mallet and gently tap the crankshaft out of the bearing. This shouldn't take a lot of force to remove, and the balance shaft will come out with the crank. And as you can see here, the rod bearing is trashed and added to my little pile of parts. Well, that's it for now. If you have any questions, feel free to get in touch. If you'd like to have some work done on your bike, links to my social media and email will be in the description. Thanks for watching.